The crowd at the Mid-South Coliseum buzzed with electricity. It was a warm evening in the summer of 1975, and every seat was taken. Teenagers clutched handmade signs, couples in their 40s whispered excitedly, and older fans sat quietly, soaking in the nostalgia. The air practically hummed with anticipation. Backstage, the king of rock and roll adjusted the collar of his white rhinestone-studded jumpsuit. He wasn't just preparing for another show. He was stepping back into the arena that had always felt like home. The lights dimmed, and the roar from the audience rose like a tidal wave. As the band struck the opening chords of C.C. Rider, a single spotlight cut through the darkness, and there he was, Elvis Presley, larger than life, yet completely present. He moved across the stage with that same effortless magnetism, every gesture charged with rhythm and charm. Fans screamed, cameras flashed, and the stadium pulsed with sound. But as Elvis scanned the sea of faces, thousands of them, something made him pause for a split second. Just past the sixth row, almost lost in the crowd, he caught sight of a small figure sitting quietly, still. While everyone else was on their feet, dancing, reaching, celebrating, this girl sat alone. Her head was down, and even from a distance, Elvis could tell. She was crying. He continued singing, not missing a beat, but the image stayed with him. Her presence, so out of sync with the energy around her, pulled at something deep in his chest. Most wouldn't have noticed her, but Elvis always had a sixth sense when it came to people, especially those who seemed lost in the noise. As the band segued into the next number, he moved closer to the edge of the stage, eyes still flicking toward her now and then, as if trying to understand without words. The girl looked up once, met his gaze for the briefest moment, then quickly looked away. That moment, that quiet, unnoticed exchange, would change everything about the night to come. She couldn't have been more than 12, maybe 13. Her hair hung loosely over her shoulders, and her arms were wrapped tightly around herself, as if holding something broken inside. The people around her hadn't noticed. They were lost in the thrill of the performance, singing along, clapping, laughing. She was surrounded by joy, but completely alone. Elvis saw her again during Love Me, and this time her shoulders were shaking. He could see the soft tremble of someone crying, trying hard not to be seen. She wasn't dressed like someone trying to get noticed. No flashy outfit, no makeup, no poster with glittered letters. Just a quiet girl sitting between two empty seats, as if she had come alone or was left alone. The security team at stage right noticed Elvis was no longer looking at the usual camera spots or stage cues. Instead, his gaze kept drifting back toward the center left of the audience. The band, too, sensed a shift. A slight pull in energy, as if he was no longer performing to a crowd, but focused on something deeply personal. What struck Elvis most wasn't just that the girl was crying. It was how she was crying. Not for attention, not for drama. It was the quiet kind of sadness, the kind that comes from something real, something recent, and something raw. He moved across the stage during You Gave Me a Mountain, deliberately positioning himself closer to her side. His eyes scanned the crowd again until they locked onto hers, and this time she didn't look away. Her eyes were red, her cheeks wet, but her expression was pure surprise. Not because she saw Elvis, but because Elvis saw her. That's when he knew. This wasn't just another fan in the crowd. Something had brought her here for a reason. And Elvis, a man who'd spent his life under the spotlight, suddenly realized his most important performance tonight wouldn't be for the crowd. It would be for her. And before the next song started, He quietly motioned for a nearby security guard to come over. Something was about to happen that no one in the arena would ever forget. The music faded as Elvis finished the final verse. The crowd cheered wildly, but he didn't move right into the next song. Instead, he walked slowly to the front of the stage and crouched down near one of the stage hands. He leaned in close, his voice barely audible above the noise, and pointed toward the sixth row. "See that little girl there?" he asked, eyes never leaving her. "Can you bring her to me?" The stagehand blinked in surprise, nodded quickly, and began to make his way along the edge of the barrier. Security took notice, whispering into earpieces, trying to make sense of what was happening. A few fans craned their necks, curious, but most had no idea that something extraordinary was unfolding. The girl sat frozen as the security guard approached her gently. She looked confused, scared even, unsure if she'd done something wrong. The guard leaned down, said something quietly, and pointed to the stage. Her eyes widened. She shook her head, hesitant, but then she looked up. And Elvis was standing at the edge of the stage, hand outstretched. The arena seemed to quiet all at once. Not completely silent, but like the world had been turned down, just for this one moment. The crowd watched as the young girl slowly stood up. She wiped her eyes, smoothed down her shirt, and took a shaky breath. Then, step by step, she was led toward the stage. She walked like someone unsure of their own existence, caught between a private grief and a public miracle. When she reached the steps, Elvis met her halfway, reaching out his hand. His smile was warm but gentle, not the flashy grin he gave the cameras. This was something else, something sincere. As their hands met, the crowd erupted again. Not with wild screams, but with a different kind of applause. The kind people give when they're witnessing something deeply human. Elvis led her carefully to a chair near the microphone stand. He knelt beside her, still holding her hand, and whispered something no one else could hear. She nodded, eyes filling with tears again. But this time, they weren't tears of sorrow. They were the tears of someone who had just been seen, understood, and accepted, in front of the whole world. And then, softly, Elvis turned back to the microphone and spoke. Elvis didn't return to the show immediately. He rested his hand gently on the girl's shoulder and looked out over the sea of faces. "Y'all," he said, his voice calm and low. "This young lady has something she wants to share." The girl looked up at him, startled. He leaned down again and whispered, "Only if you want to, honey." She hesitated, then slowly brought the microphone toward her lips. "My name's Lily," she said, barely above a whisper. "I'm here because my daddy was supposed to bring me." The crowd was quiet now, eerily quiet. Every face turned toward her, every heart leaning in. "He bought these tickets 6 months ago," she continued. "It was supposed to be our night. He loved your music more than anything. But he passed away 3 weeks ago. A heart attack. It was sudden." She swallowed hard. "Mama couldn't come. She's still not ready. But I didn't want to waste the tickets, so I came alone." A soft gasp moved through the audience like a ripple across water. Elvis lowered his head, visibly moved. For a long moment, he said nothing, just stood beside her, hand resting gently on her shoulder. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. "Thank you for sharing that, Lily. Your daddy sounds like a good man. And I'm honored you chose to come here tonight, not just for him, but for yourself." He turned back to the audience. "This is why music matters, folks. It brings us together when we're hurting. It gives us something to hold on to." He walked over to his band and whispered something to the pianist. A few quiet notes floated through the arena. the soft, unmistakable intro to Can't Help Falling in Love. Elvis returned to Lily's side, took her hand once more, and began to sing. Not to the thousands in the room, not to the cameras, but to one small, grieving girl who'd come alone to find a piece of her father in the voice he had loved. The tears came freely now, from Lily, from Elvis, from countless people in the crowd who found themselves unexpectedly caught in the moment. What was supposed to be just another concert had become something more, a moment of healing, shared by strangers, held together by music. The final note of Can't Help Falling in Love lingered like a blessing in the air. Elvis's voice had softened into something raw. Less performance, more prayer. When the song ended, there was no instant eruption of applause. For a long, delicate second, the crowd simply sat in silence, breathing it in. Then, slowly, people stood. A wave of applause began in the front row and traveled backward like a rising tide. It wasn't the wild frenzy of fans, it was something more reverent. A standing ovation not for a hit song, but for a moment of truth, for a shared ache, for a man who had used the biggest stage in the world to spotlight a child's pain and to turn it into something beautiful. Elvis turned to Lily again and whispered something that made her smile through the tears. Then, in front of everyone, he pulled a small white silk scarf from his pocket, the kind he always wore during performances, and gently tied it around her wrist. "Your daddy's with you," he said softly. "And now so am I." The crowd exploded in a swell of emotion. People weren't just clapping anymore. Some were crying openly, arms around loved ones, strangers hugging strangers. Something had cracked open in that moment, and everyone in the room felt it. The stage lights dimmed slightly as Elvis asked for a stool to be brought to the center. He sat down beside Lily, picked up a guitar, and began to strum softly. It wasn't part of the planned set list. The band, sensing the shift, stayed quiet. No drums, no horns, just Elvis and a guitar under a soft amber light, singing Peace in the Valley, a gospel favorite of his mother's, and one of the songs he often turned to when life got too heavy. He sang with his eyes closed, as if channeling every ounce of comfort he could offer the world in that moment. When he finished, he stood, turned to Lily, and held out his arms. She stepped into them without hesitation. The embrace wasn't long, but it didn't need to be. It was everything. There was no script for what Elvis had done. No manager had planned it. No camera angle had been rehearsed. But it became the most unforgettable part of the entire night. A moment of pure, unscripted humanity. By the time Elvis helped Lily back to her seat in the 6th row, the concert had shifted into something else entirely. Sure, the band eventually picked up the beat again, and he went on to perform crowd favorites like Suspicious Minds and Burning Love. But everyone there knew they were no longer just at a concert. They were part of a memory, one that would outlast the night, the music, even the man himself. Lily sat quietly, the white scarf now resting in her lap like a sacred object. People around her offered gentle smiles, tissues, even held her hand during the slower songs. It didn't matter that no one knew her name before tonight. Now, she felt seen. Not just by Elvis, but by everyone around her. Backstage, Elvis was quieter than usual during intermission. One of his bandmates approached him, asking if he wanted to take a longer break. But he just shook his head. "No," he said softly. "We're doing something real tonight." After the final encore, as the crowd filed out into the night, still buzzing, still wide-eyed, stories began to ripple through Memphis. People couldn't stop talking about what had happened. Some called radio stations to describe it live on air. Others wrote letters to local newspapers. And one photographer, seated far back with a telephoto lens, had captured a now iconic shot. Elvis kneeling beside a small girl in the spotlight, her face turned up to him, tears glistening on her cheeks. The image would later appear on the cover of a music magazine with a single caption, "The night the king shared his crown." And for those who had been there, all 10,000 of them, it became a story they told their children and their grandchildren. Not about the hits Elvis played or the jumpsuit he wore, but about the moment a global superstar paused everything for one lonely girl in a crowd. In hotel bars and living rooms across the country, the story spread like wildfire. Not because it was flashy, but because it was real. And in a world full of showbiz, that kind of sincerity was rare, precious. Elvis had always said that music should touch the soul. That night, he didn't just sing to the crowd, he healed them. Starting with a little girl named Lily, who needed it most. Years passed, and the world moved forward. New stars rose, trends changed, and stages got brighter and louder. But that one night in Memphis stayed alive in the hearts of those who witnessed it. The girl Elvis had brought on stage, Lily, grew up, carrying that moment with her not as a celebrity encounter, but as something far more sacred. In interviews years later, she would describe it not as the night she met Elvis Presley, but as the night someone finally saw her pain and answered it with kindness instead of indifference. She never became a singer or an entertainer. Lily chose a quieter path. She became a counselor for children who had lost their parents, because she remembered what it felt like to be alone in a room full of noise, and how one person's presence made all the difference. The scarf Elvis gave her, she kept it in a shadow box above her desk, not for what it was made of, but for what it represented. A moment of compassion from someone who could have ignored her, but didn't. For Elvis, that night became one of those rare stories that even the tabloids couldn't twist. It didn't need embellishment. It stood on its own, a quiet testament to the kind of man he was when the lights weren't blinding and the cameras weren't rolling. A man raised by a woman who taught him that kindness is never wasted, and that fame means nothing if you forget where you came from. Some called it a miracle. Others called it fate. But perhaps it was simply what happens when someone with a platform chooses empathy over performance, and humanity over ego. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that kindness still matters, that the smallest act can change a life, then help keep this legacy alive. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this, where real moments matter more than headlines. Give this video a thumbs up if it reminded you of the power of empathy.